remember when I first went to the pastor with news that I was thinking about going into ministry. My emotions were a mixture of nervous and excited. And with a big grin I said, "I've decided to become a pastor like you." The response was, "That's nice." And that was it. Now, hang on, I see a lot of people looking over at Pastor Kim. For the record, I'm going to set it straight. It was not Pastor Kim who I spoke to this first time, nor was it Reverend Art, so they're both off the hook. In fact, the who, when, and where isn't really as important as the words that were spoken to me and the way they were said. I had felt God was calling me to a commitment in the church that would require years of study and practice and dedication, a whole lifetime dedicated to this. And somehow my news that was just delivered seemed about as interesting or as important as saying, "I've decided to have a tuna sandwich for lunch today." I was already feeling a little unsure about taking this next step. And the encounter kind of left me feeling like maybe I misheard God's plan for my life. It'd be a while before I could even reconsider this again. Well, let's fast forward to Pastor Kim's first year in his interim position at Woodmont. In the time between the first story and this one, I continually felt something tugging at me. When I finally couldn't ignore this call to ordained ministry anymore, I went to Pastor Kim with the news. And like my first attempt years before, I said, "I've decided to become a pastor." I waited for that unenthusiastic response, but instead this pastor said, "Wow, that is really exciting. Why don't we go to my office and you can tell me all about it?" That changed everything for me. To have someone reaffirm what others had been suggesting and what I was slowly realizing for myself was exactly what I needed to explore the ways in which God would use me to do God's work in the world. I told Pastor Kim about my life growing up in this church, leaving God and my faith behind when college came around, only to eventually find my way back to the church and back to God years later. Pastor Kim smiled at this and said, "God found you a long time ago. You just finally noticed." The Old Testament reading we heard today is one told at a lot of ordinations. It's the story of young Samuel who was still learning about God and how to serve God through the teachings of his mentor Eli. And over he hears that voice calling, "Samuel, Samuel." And so he keeps running to Eli because who the heck else could be calling him? And this happens over and over until And Eli keeps telling him, lie down, until finally Eli, with his years of knowledge and his experience, realizes it's God who's calling Samuel. So he takes a moment to instruct Samuel on how to respond when God calls. And what did he say? If the Lord calls again, say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And when God calls, Samuel is now ready to listen, to respond, and to take his next steps. Now, like I said, this is used in a lot of ordinations because it focuses on someone embracing their call into a new ministry, this call from God. The main focus tends to be on Samuel, but we shouldn't overlook the actions of his mentor Eli. He could have said, "Samuel, I swear if you tell me you're hearing voices one more time, I'm getting you checked out." No, he doesn't do that. Instead, he invests the time to figure out what's happening in Samuel's life and then teach him how to live into God's call. I'm up here preaching today because not just Pastor Kim, not just Reverend Art, but all of you have taken the time to invest in someone's ministry and call. And this isn't a sermon, though, on how to support your clergy. It's a sermon on how to support one another. If God invested and continues to invest time in every one of us, and if we're seeking to do God's work in the world, then that means it's our God-given duty to invest in one another in discovering whatever our individual ministries and calls may be. Last week during announcements, I briefly told the story of how once I knew I was 100% sure this was the path, I announced at church one day saying, "I want to let you know I'm becoming a minister." And Reverend Art chimed in with a big grin on his face saying, "You're already a minister. You're just going to be an ordained one." That was the first time I've really looked at ministry this way. Growing up in the Catholic Church, I was used to a hierarchy of positions. The higher up the ladder you were, the closer to God you must be, and the more important your work must be. But what do we have listed every week in our bulletins under minister? Anyone see that on the front of your bulletin? What does it say next to minister? All members. This idea goes back 502 years to the Reformation and Martin Luther, who pushed back against the idea of some people being more holy than others. He said that the Pope or Bishop anoints, ordains, consecrates, or dresses different from the laity, might make a hypocrite or an idolatrous oil-painted icon, but in no way makes a Christian or a spiritual human being. He saw this idea of a universal priesthood of all believers. And he saw it in passages like one from 1 Peter, which says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of God who called you out of darkness into God's marvelous light." My time with Reverend Art has reinforced this idea. Part of his role is to serve as my mentor for my classes for school. And we meet throughout, and during these classes we talk about whatever topics I happen to be studying. I ask not just his thoughts on these topics, but how he's experienced these things in the context of his own ministry. The stories are not just Reverend Art telling me, "I did this and I did that." These stories involve people. Members who work together to solve problems, pray together, comfort one another, serve their communities, and more. The Christian life is not to be lived in isolation. We function as a unit, and each of us has different gifts and skills that cover every area of ministry. Paul's letter to the Romans, which Carol read before, said, "We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness." If your thinking is similar to what mine had been, that a pastor is holier than lay people, or their work is more important, I offer you one simple image. Think about the symbolism of where the pastor enters from at the beginning of the service. Maybe not in every church, but in this church and many others. The pastor comes from the people. The pastor enters through the same door everybody else does, walks among all of us here, and then comes forward to lead the service. Not only does this say the pastor is just like everyone in the pews, but it also shows that a church's greatest strength, besides God, is its people. Perhaps if Paul were around today, he'd have an even longer list of gifts to write about. The musician in melody making, the deacon in planning, the Christian educator in faith formation, the steward in caring for property and stewardship, and on and on and on this list would go. Today on Ministry Sunday, we lift up all the amazing ministries of this church and thank God for the talents that we've been blessed with. So embrace your roles as Samuels, turning to God and saying, "Speak, your servant is listening." But also, take a look around at the people gathered here today. May we also learn to be Eli's to every Samuel worshiping with us in this room full of ministers as we invest our time and our energy helping one another discover God's call for our lives and the amazing work we'll do when we come together as one. Amen.